It was a sweltering day in Lagos, the bustling city that never seemed to sleep. The humidity hung thick in the air, making every breath feel like a struggle. In the heart of this concrete jungle, a small clinic stood unassumingly, its faded sign barely visible against the backdrop of the towering buildings that loomed over it. Inside, the waiting area was packed with people from all walks of life, each one clutching a piece of paper bearing their reason for being there. Some cradled swollen bellies, while others nursed aching limbs or feverish children. It was a microcosm of the city's struggle, a place where desperation and hope mingled in equal measure. Among the sea of faces, one man stood out. His name was Emeka, and he sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Beads of sweat trickled down his forehead, but his expression remained stoic, betraying none of the turmoil that raged within. Emeka had always been a man of traditional values, raised in a small village where the lines between men and women were clearly defined. But something had changed within him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It started with the persistent nausea and fatigue, which he had initially brushed off as a bout of food poisoning. Then came the strange cravings and the tenderness in his abdomen. At first, he had dismissed these symptoms, convincing himself that it was nothing more than stress or overwork. But as the weeks passed, his body began to change in ways he couldn't ignore. His once flat stomach started to swell, and his breast became tender and swollen. Panic had set in, and Emeka found himself at the doorstep of this unassuming clinic, seeking answers to a question he dared not voice aloud. Could it be possible? Could a man truly be pregnant? The wait seemed interminable, but finally a nurse called his name, beckoning him into the examination room. Emeka's heart pounded in his chest as he followed her, each step feeling heavier than the last. The doctor, a kind-eyed woman named Dr. Adanna, greeted him with a warm smile that did little to calm his nerves. She listened intently as Emeka recounted his symptoms, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Have you experienced any changes in your intimate areas?" she asked delicately. And Emeka felt his face flush with embarrassment. Reluctantly, he nodded, and Dr. Adanna's expression shifted to one of understanding. She asked him to lie back on the examination table and gently palpated his abdomen, her fingers prodding and pressing. Emeka held his breath, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to block out the myriad of thoughts that raced through his mind. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke played by the universe. But then, Dr. Adanna spoke the words that would forever change his life. "Mr. Emeka," she said softly, "you're pregnant." The room seemed to spin, and Emeka felt as though the ground had opened up beneath him. Pregnant? Him? It was impossible, unnatural, a defiance of every law of nature he had ever known. Dr. Adanna must have sensed his disbelief, for she quickly launched into an explanation. "It's an extremely rare condition called persistent Mullerian duct syndrome," she said, her voice calm and measured. "In some cases, a genetic abnormality causes a man to develop female reproductive organs alongside male ones." Emeka's mind reeled, struggling to process this information. He had always considered himself a devout Christian, and this revelation shook the very foundations of his faith. "But how?" he managed to croak out, his throat dry and constricted. Dr. Adanna offered him a sympathetic smile. "It's not uncommon for men with this condition to experience spontaneous pregnancies, especially if they've been sexually active," she explained gently. Emeka's thoughts immediately turned to his wife, Adanna. They had been trying for a child for years, enduring the pitying looks and whispered rumors that often accompanied infertility in their close-knit community. Could this be a miracle? As if reading his mind, Dr. Adanna continued, "I know this must be a lot to take in, but you're not alone. There are support groups and resources available to help you through this journey." Emeka nodded numbly, his mind still reeling from the news. He couldn't even begin to imagine how he would explain this to Adanna, let alone his family and friends. The following weeks were a blur of appointments, tests, and consultations. Emeka found himself navigating a world he had never known existed, a world where men could bear children and defy the very laws of nature. As his pregnancy progressed, his body continued to change, his once flat abdomen swelling into a distinct baby bump. He marveled at the life growing within him, a life he had never dared to dream of carrying. But with the physical changes came emotional turmoil. Emeka found himself battling waves of anxiety and self-doubt, questioning his masculinity and his place in the world. He withdrew from his friends and family, afraid of the judgment and ridicule that would surely follow if they learned the truth. Adanna, his ever-patient wife, tried her best to support him, but even she couldn't fully understand the depths of his struggle. She would often find him sitting alone in the dimly lit living room, his hands cradling the swell of his belly, his eyes distant and haunted. "Talk to me, my love," she would implore, her voice laced with concern. "Let me in. We're in this together." But Emeka remained guarded, his emotions locked away behind an impenetrable wall. How could he burden her with the weight of his shame and confusion when she had already sacrificed so much in her pursuit of motherhood? As the months passed, Emeka's isolation deepened, and he found himself retreating further into the shadows of his own mind. The once vibrant man who had been the life of every gathering was now a mere shadow of himself, consumed by the secret he carried within. It wasn't until one fateful night, when the contractions began, that Emeka was jolted back to reality. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a searing agony that ripped through his body with each wave. Adanna sprang into action, her eyes wide with panic and disbelief. She had known about Emeka's condition, but seeing him double over in pain, his face contorted in anguish, made it all too real. They rushed to the hospital, Emeka clutching the seat as wave after wave of contractions tore through him. The nurses and doctors stared in disbelief, but Dr. Adeola was there, her calm presence a beacon in the storm. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Emeka's cries echoed through the delivery room, mingling with the sounds of encouragement from the medical staff and Adanna's soothing words. And then, in a moment that defied all logic and reason, a tiny cry pierced the air. A child born from the womb of a man, emerged into the world, its tiny fists clenched and its face scrunched in protest. Emeka's world ground to a halt, and time seemed to stand still. He stared in awe at the tiny bundle that was placed in his trembling arms, his eyes brimming with tears of joy and disbelief. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the stares, not the whispers, not the judgment that he knew would inevitably follow. All that mattered was this tiny life, this miracle that had defied the odds and proven that love could conquer even the most impossible of circumstances. As Emeka cradled his newborn child, he felt a profound shift within himself. The shame and self-doubt that had plagued him for months melted away, replaced by a fierce sense of pride and love that he had never known possible. He was a father, a bearer of life, and in that moment, he knew that he had been given a gift greater than any he could have imagined. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, filled with challenges and obstacles that he could scarcely fathom. But as he looked into the eyes of his child, he knew that he would face them all with an unwavering strength and determination. For in that moment, Emeka had transcended the boundaries of what society deemed possible. He had become a living embodiment of the power of love, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity for miracles to flourish in even the most unlikely of places. And as the first rays of dawn crept through the hospital window, illuminating the tiny face of his newborn, Emeka knew that his life would never be the same again. He was no longer just a man. He was a father, a trailblazer, and a living embodiment of the unbreakable bond between parent and child. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Emeka's story was just beginning, and the world would never be the same.